Andrea Hanson, welcome to Food Experience Unplugged.
Thank you, Michelle. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here as a trauma expert. That's very needed in our day and age. And we're so happy to have you here. To get started, will you take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us what brought you to this point in your life and career and why the direction of trauma? This podcast is available on multiple platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others. Please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to be informed as new episodes become available. If you enjoyed today's episode or any of our episodes, please rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. As always, check out our website at foodexperienceunplugged.com for some resources as you begin your health journey.
Yeah, it's been a journey. So I'll try to keep it contained. So growing up, I saw quite a few therapists. My parents were divorced, so we saw court psychologists, we saw court mandated therapists, and I never really felt like they saw me or listened to me or gave me what I needed. It was a really rough environment a lot of the time. And yet at therapist's office, I was playing in the sand or drawing pictures that were being analyzed. There was no real work being done. And then as a teenager, a lot of my what I now know were symptoms of trauma started really coming out, and I started really struggling. And in response to that, my parents decided to send me to an inpatient treatment center, which again was very unhelpful, re-traumatizing in a lot of ways. I was there for about 6 months. And at that point, I decided that I wanted to become a therapist that actually helped people, that saw them, that listened to them, that offered them help, right? So I went to school, went to graduate school, became a therapist. And during graduate school, I was under the impression that I think a lot of people are under when it comes to trauma of if you're looking at trauma, it means that you're blaming other people for your problems and you're being a victim, right? So I was like, oh, I don't really want to work with trauma. I want to do other stuff. I want to help people in other ways. I felt the same way about addiction. I didn't understand addiction. But then I went into my first internship at an addiction clinic, and I started to really see what was happening, which was that addiction was, again, a symptom of trauma. And so many things were a symptom of trauma. So I started going to all kinds of specialized trainings and working with my clients, gaining experience. And the more and more I understood trauma and the neurobiology of trauma, the more it became very clear to me that it's at the basis of so many things. So many of the diagnoses that we see as separate are actually just symptoms, various symptoms of trauma. And there's lots of science out there. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is one of the main leading research scientists, research psychologists about trauma and how the body stores it and how the brain is disrupted by trauma, and that causes all kinds of symptoms. So now I've focused my practice primarily on complex trauma, which is a little bit different than primary trauma or trauma that we think of. We think of trauma as like one big event that happens, when in complex trauma, it's really more small events that happen or complicated events that happen within the family. Like if you get hit by a car, that's traumatic, but you can go out and you can talk about it. And people will, there's the car and the car's the bad guy and you're the pedestrian and you got hit and you're the good guy. So there is more cut and dry. It is traumatic, but more cut and dry. Whereas if something traumatic is happening within the family, usually you can't talk about it. There's a lot more shame involved in it. There's a lot of love a lot of times for the perpetrator. And there's not always a clear distinction between who's at fault, right? So it's a lot more complicated of a situation, and it gets stored in so many levels of our body.
Okay. Wow, that's a lot. And I love how you turned a potentially negative situation with your early trauma, you turned it around to pay it forward and help people to overcome those struggles that you went through in your earlier years.
Yeah, thank you. It really does give a sense of meaning and purpose to what I do. So even in the times that I'm really struggling or not very motivated, I can step into that sense of meaning, and it really helps a lot with me being able to do what I do.
Sure, absolutely. Now, just to kind of take a step back for a minute, what exactly do we mean by trauma? And you mentioned that there were different types. Could you go into that a little bit more and help us understand that part of it?
Yeah, so trauma is any time that your body, your system is so overwhelmed with external stimuli, and especially threatening external stimuli, that it stops doing what it would normally be doing thinking, resting, digesting, daydreaming, and it goes into a different state where it's fight, flight, or freeze for the most part, where the upper areas of the brain drain from blood, and that disrupts the development of those areas. And
Mm,
the blood shifts to the other areas, making the heart rate go up or sometimes even slow down significantly, and focus more on getting through that moment or that situation.
okay. And then with the complex, you've got that, I guess, another layer on the situation.
Yeah, yeah, it's oftentimes less of life or death situations, but the body still reacts to it that way. So say for example, adoption. Even if an adopted child goes to a really loving family, they've experienced trauma because they were taken from their mother, who they were in the mother's womb for 9 months, and they develop an attachment and a sense of security. And in reality, humans can't survive without their caregivers. If as a baby we're dropped in the woods, we're going to die.
Sure.
And then if you take a baby away, it has that same response of, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. So it's perceived threat from within the system, not perceived threat as an observer. So
Mm,
if you
okay.
witness domestic violence in the home, same situation, perceived threat as a child. If my caregiver is harmed, what if I get harmed? What if I'm not taken care of? Or if a parent is struggling with addiction or depression, or something that is taking their focus away from caregiving, there's going to be a similar response from within the child, this perceived threat of I'm not okay. And then evolutionarily, we're set up to internalize things as children. It wouldn't make much sense for us to, as little children, say 4 or 5 year old, look at our parents and say, wow, there's something wrong with these guys, they're not doing what they need to be doing as their parent, as my parents, right?
Mhm.
Instead, we look at it and we say, okay, what's wrong with me? So if dad is coming home angry, or if mom or dad have random angry outbursts, we don't think as kids, oh, they have anger problems. That's something they need to deal with. We think, and not just think consciously, but in our bodies, we start to try to mitigate and adapt to the situation to make it so that they're angry less often at us. We feel like we're at fault and we're in control of it. And those
Mhm.
mitigations and adaptations, mitigations meaning trying to avoid the harm, and adaptation meaning trying to create a life around the harm,
Mhm.
those become behaviors and patterns and symptoms throughout our lives.
Okay. Wow. Now, does it the I guess the reactions or the type of trauma or things of that nature, does it depend on the age of the person or the circumstances of the trauma? Are there just many different situations, or are there any patterns that you've seen with your research and with your work?
Yeah, there are patterns, and a really interesting researcher to look into to see more about that is Martin Teicher. He's done a lot of research using brain scans from different people at different ages experiencing different types of trauma. And there are some patterns there. One pattern that I've noticed a lot that um, is pertinent to this platform as well is when children are in divorce situations at a young age, they often develop eating habit issues, binging, binging eating habit tendencies.
Okay.
Sometimes with the purging, sometimes binging and then restricting for a while and then binging again. But that's a really common one that I've seen.
Okay. Okay. And now as far as, it's a great segue into the eating portion of it. Now, how does that trauma influence us toward our eating habits? You mentioned, as a child, binging or purging, that type of thing. Is it mainly seen as does it manifest itself, I guess, as eating disorders, or are there other aspects of how that affects eating?
Yeah, it affects it in multiple ways. Um, yeah, eating disorders is a big one. Eating disorders a lot of times stem from a sense of trying to control something, right? And sometimes it's trying to control an emotion. So what I've seen often as far as the binging goes is suddenly this child's in a chaotic environment. They're more lonely than usual. Um, yeah, it's chaotic and they're lonely and they don't really know what's going on. And food is comforting. For our whole lives, food is very comforting. So instead of having the regular routine that they're doing and feeling the regular emotions, now they have this void. and they fill it with food, with eating, and that develops into more binging type eating disorders. On the other end, sometimes there's a control, a need to feel like, okay, I need to control the situation and I don't know what I can control other than my food intake. So that's where we see people stop eating. They're not going to, and sometimes that's even involved in the new financial situation of, particularly like a divorce. There's usually financial stress that comes with that. So sometimes children
Okay.
will stop eating and get this idea that I can't eat because we don't have the money, even if they do.
Okay. So now, do you primarily work with children then, or do you work with adults as well?
I work primarily with adolescents and adults. Um,
Okay.
the but the root of most things that adults struggle with is from childhood, and it's been there either present or dormant for a very long time. A lot of times things are dormant until adolescence, and the brain starts rapidly developing in a lot of ways, and it unlocks these things that are dormant. And then a lot of times, what we see too, and this goes a little bit deeper into eating, is when you experience trauma, and especially repetitive trauma, it changes the cells in your body. It changes the way that you fight off disease and what your body considers disease, considers a threat. So a lot of times you start to see around the age of 30 inflammatory diseases and obesity that stem from early childhood trauma. So we'll have adult women, usually sometimes adult men, that are really struggling with their weight and don't know what is happening because they exercise and they exercise and they eat well, but they're storing fat. And what's happening is their body, when it's introduced to stress, is pumping their blood system full of sugars and fats because that's their stress response. So even doing something like running, if you have a history of childhood trauma, can actually make you gain weight because it's triggering that stress response.
Okay. So it's as far as childhood trauma, it was just unresolved. They had the trauma, then they went on with their lives, and I guess they thought they were okay, but
Yeah,
then issues are coming out.
yeah, totally. I mean, we all like to think that, I'm an adult now, I'm over things. If we don't think about it constantly, if we're not having nightmares, if we're not, emotionally distressed when we think about it, we think we're fine and I'm over it and it's okay. When in reality, it affected us on a much deeper level than our thoughts and our emotions.
Okay. Okay. Now, how does that, you mentioned, around 30, they have, whether it's weight issues or things of that nature. How does, I guess, how do you undo the potential damage that's been done? What exactly, or how that process works per se?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple different layers, a couple different levels that can be done. Of course, seeking help from a complex trauma specialist, like myself, is really beneficial for doing that deep dive, doing rewiring on the lower levels of the brain and the body. And when you're looking at complex trauma therapy, it shouldn't look like sitting and talking. That's only 2% effective at healing trauma. So you want to look for a specialist, a therapist, or a spiritual guider that understands the neurobiology of trauma, that really knows how deeply it's affected the body and does things in the lower brain and involves body movement in the sessions. That's so
Mhm.
vital to healing trauma. Some other things to do on your own are just breath work, noticing breath that actually helps build up pathways in the brain that are important for healing the body. And there's a certain kind of yoga, it's interoceptive yoga. And instead of it being an instructor telling you what to do with your body, it's an instructor suggesting things that you can do with your body. And then inviting you to notice the different sensations that are happening within your body as you move. And that type of exercise is really healing for trauma in the body and much more beneficial for a traumatized body than something like running.
Okay. So typically you'll kind of dive into one of these areas, I guess, depending on their needs then?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a couple different. So as far as the interoceptive yoga, if anyone's interested, I have a recording that I can send to get started in that. It's not a very common type of yoga. Um, and then another thing that I've developed is it's called lifestyle prescriptions. And instead of assessing symptoms and then putting you in a diagnostic box, we assess symptoms and then identify those exact areas of the brain that are under functioning, that have been impacted by trauma, and then offer do-it-yourself activities at home to help optimize those. And there's so many different ways that the brain is impacted and the body is impacted by trauma, that there's so many different things that can be done to help resolve it. It can be as simple as making eye contact on a daily basis and making facial expressions back and forth with someone. That can really help heal the very lowest region of the brain, the region that's online when we're first born. When we're first born, we only have a very, very small part of our brain, and part of that is the part that lights up when we make eye contact. So
Okay.
that just making eye contact and facial expressions can be really healing for the lower brain and body.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now, does someone know? How would someone know that they're okay? I've had trauma, and I was resolved it or whatever. How do they know to seek a therapist such as yourself versus okay, well, maybe there's something wrong with me biologically. I should see my doctor. How does that? How do you determine where where the root cause is?
Yeah, that's a difficult question that the medical field in general hasn't really answered yet. And I think that's partially due to not a lot of communication across specialties. Optimally, it would be great if we had clinics where you go and you get an assessment and all of the different professionals look at it so that everyone can come up with their theories and ideas of what would be beneficial. Um, what I've found most is that when it comes down to trauma, it's it's usually most obvious when you have been to the doctor a couple of times and the doctor has not been able to figure out what's going on, or they have given you suggestions or things that haven't really worked for you. I think it's always good to at least assess and see, could this be trauma related? Is there something there that could be resolved to help? Um, if you're on quite a few medications for different things, if you find that you need diet pills to be able to get results, or if you're not getting results with personal trainers, then that's a good time to seek out a trauma specialist.
Okay. And now, does it depend on the type of trauma? Would someone know, "Oh, yes, but I remember now back when I was this age, something happened." Um, or do you find in other patients, maybe it's repressed trauma that they may not remember that?
Yeah, it can be both. And repressed trauma is interesting because it's not really repressed, it's never processed. So part of the brain disrupting in the moment of trauma is that it doesn't store memories in the way that we think of memories. It stores them very fragmented. So instead you have these random body sensations that come up out of nowhere that don't make any sense, or these random images or thoughts that come out of nowhere that you can't put together into a fully formed thought or a fully formed memory. So oftentimes that's how trauma doesn't end up getting recognized as trauma. We don't remember it. That a lot of times we just don't acknowledge it as trauma because of the way that we think about trauma. And we want to protect the people around us. We want to say, no, I had good parents, or I was raised by good caregivers, and my life was really good. And that can be the case, and we can have a lot of deep love and respect for people in our lives, and at the same time acknowledge that some things didn't go quite right. And it can really be anything. It just depends on the person's individual system. Because again, trauma isn't about the event, it's about how the body responded to the event. So I've worked with clients who had very perfectionist homes. And there was a very specific way that you needed to act and feel and talk and present yourself to the world. And that caused trauma in a way that we don't necessarily think of trauma. And actually, those households have the highest suicide rates among their teenagers, the high achieving households. So
Wow.
it can look like anything.
Okay. So it just kind of really it depends. Every situation a little bit unique? Have
Yep,
you found?
yep. Every situation is very unique.
Okay. Wow. So um have you found, if therapy or whatever the traumatic situation as a child, if they received therapy and potentially resolved that issue, can it still manifest itself later in life?
Yeah, and there's so many layers to what happens with trauma that I don't know. I don't know that resolved is necessarily even the right word. Pulling it apart, looking through it, realigning the body, recalibrating the system, bringing all of the different parts of the self into an organized unit. um, is really the goal of therapy, so that you are fully resourcing, rather than being pushed back into a trauma response when triggers arise, that you're able to resource the areas of your body that are meant to heal. Bodies are set up to heal, just like when we get a cut. If we put
Mhm.
the right ointment and a band-aid on it, it'll heal. We're also able to heal from trauma on our own, given the right circumstances and given the right ability to resource. So that's the goal of therapy, is to open the body to resourcing, to realignment, to recalibration, so that as these things come up in the future, you have that ability to acknowledge it, to sit with it, to resource what you need to move through it.
Okay. Okay. Now, for someone in that situation, what is the process that they go through to, well, not resolve it, but I come to terms with it, to recognize it, however you'd like, whatever words that would describe the situation. What is that process?
Yeah, it's so unique for every individual person, but the general process is getting in touch with the self and with the body, acknowledging those deep level thoughts, those belief systems that we start to believe about ourselves, whether it's I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm stupid. And a lot of times these are so deep down, we don't acknowledge that they're happening. Um, so taking that time to really, really notice, like when I get triggered, instead of noticing what the other person did, oh, they made me upset, they were mean to me, um, they didn't like my idea, whatever it is. And of course, those are basic triggers. I know that there are much bigger triggers out there that are really gnarly, right?
Mhm.
Um, and noticing instead, what do I think this means about me? When this happened, what came up about me that I am, um, I'm not worthwhile. I'm not worth their time. I'm not worth their attention. What is that? And that automatically takes you from more of a head space to more of a gut space. And that feel that in there when you start to acknowledge those things about yourself. And then you notice the somatics. And somatics are the body symptoms that happen, with emotions. So you notice the somatics. Where are those emotions in your body? Then you might, be able to, from that space, breathe into it, acknowledge it, let it hold some space in your body. Just look at it for a while and see, what does this part of me need from me? Where did this come from? When did I develop this idea? And then start to analyze it. Is this true about me? What are some examples of times that I can prove that I have been lovable? Right? What is the contrary evidence to what I'm experiencing right now? And a really important part to healing trauma is that there's no internal rejection. We don't say, okay, there's this part of me that thinks they're stupid, and I'm just going to put her in a corner and shove her in a basement and say, oh, you go sit over there because I'm trying to live my best life right now, and you're getting in my way, right? Is that you're taking a traumatized part of self and you're traumatizing that part of self, and it's still a part of self, right? And these parts of self develop in those moments of brain disruption um, when something that happens is that the brain doesn't distinguish the passing of time when the brain is disrupted in a
Mm.
traumatic way. So those pieces of your body, of your nervous system, of yourself get stuck throughout your lifespan. So when we acknowledge those different body sensations, it gives us clues as to which parts of self are scattered throughout the lifespan. And then we want to nurture them back into the present. So, okay, wow, like I'm realizing that I think that I am, another common one with eating troubles is, wow, I'm realizing that every time throughout my life that I was thin, I got unwanted attention from people, and people noticing that I was thin, maybe people leering at me in ways that I didn't want them to leer at me. And so this part of self is very, very, very afraid of being thin, does not want to be thin. So then that part comes out and we view it as self-sabotage. But really it's that part getting its needs met and saying like, no, 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 we're not safe. So, so like, oh gosh, I dropped 10 pounds and then I start eating everything in sight and I just gain it right back. Or even you drop 10 pounds and you keep eating the exact same way and you gain it all back because that part of self is so stressed that sugar and fat starts pumping into the body and blowing the body back up again. Right. So
Right.
that part of self needs to be nurtured and acknowledged. And it feels really silly, but you can have conversations with that part of yourself and say, like, hey, look, like I know when we were, maybe a preteen or whatever and started losing weight and developing a figure that we got and wanted attention, and that was scary and that was uncomfortable. And and sitting with that for a minute and being like, hey, and now, I'm 30, I'm 40, and I'm taking care of myself in like so many different ways. We're so much stronger now when it comes to being able to face these layers of these comments that we get from other people, and we're actually really safe and independent. And right now we really need to focus on our weight so that we can live our healthy lives that we want to do. Is it because this, while you think that you're protecting me, while you think that you're protecting us, you're really holding me back from all of these things that I want to do in our lives. So how about you come join me in the present and let's work on this together? That makes sense. Feels silly,
Okay.
but it's also really helpful.
Sure. So you're basically almost having a discussion with your trauma to
Yeah.
really resolve that and get and figure it out.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. With that traumatized self that's just stuck in the past and it's still in you. It still makes up the body that you live in today.
Okay. So now, does it involve, you mentioned there are a lot of different things with breath work, with yoga, with other things. I mean, does it start, is that kind of the okay, now that we understand the trauma, here's what we should do. At first, you basically have a lot of conversations with your clients as far as okay, what the trauma was and really understanding, and then moving forward toward different things, or does that work in tandem, really?
Yeah, it works in tandem. Really hashing through it and understanding exactly what it is isn't necessary. And that's part of the whole old idea of like let's talk about it, and then as we talk about it, we can create a different story and we can desensitize you to it by talking about it in detail. But that's super unnecessary. So what it what it typically looks like in my sessions is well, and I do like psychedelic assisted sessions as well. So that's a whole different thing that it's a way bigger deep dive. But in a typical session, we just start out with what's present, what's right now, what's bothering you right now. And then we go deeper and deeper and deeper. And we follow the brain and the body to where it needs to go. And we incorporate different body movements and also bilateral stimulation. You might have heard of EMDR. It makes the lower parts of the brain communicate with each other better.
Okay.
So we activate that, and then we follow the body, and we do body movements and breaths all throughout a system in one session. So it's all intertwined together, as opposed to um, hashing it out first and then creating a plan. And sometimes, as we go in and as we follow the body, things pop up that hadn't been fully assimilated in memory, but now the body is putting it together and saying, oh, okay, this is what happened. And then we're in a space to be able to go in and recalibrate that memory and bring that part into the present in that session.
Okay. Interesting. I love that. So you basically focus more on the EMDR side of it and really kind of being more holistic about the approach that you use.
Yeah, yeah. So there's some EMDR involved. There's some, a lot of times my clients will do a lot of movement. So they'll put their body in the position of what the emotion feels like, right? So if it's shame, um, often what I see is clients will curl up on the ground and hide their face in their hands. And then when the body's in that position, it opens it up to being able to move out of that position, which a lot of times in a moment of trauma, we're unable to move. It's part of that dorsal response of freezing, right?
Sure.
So you're freezing in that traumatic experience and you're not able to do anything about it. And that happens, in all kinds of, witnessing parents fighting. Oftentimes children will just kind of hide and make their bodies go stiff because they're trying to not exist in that moment, right?
Mm.
As
Okay.
much as possible. So being able to get into that body space where the body feels stiff and frozen, and then allowing the body to move from that space heals that trauma on a body level that talking about the trauma doesn't allow for.
Okay. Interesting. I love that. I love how you're just really taking a deep dive into that to really heal the trauma, heal the situation. Now, what with regard to the eating and that progression, are there any success stories that you could share with us, or of people who have really come to terms with that situation? They've restored their healthy eating habits or developed some new ones?
Yeah, absolutely. Several. The first that comes to mind was a client I had last year. She struggled with chronic binging. She was binging every night after the kids went to bed, which is so common with binge eating. After the kids go to bed, she's raiding the cupboards, eating everything until she's sick, and sometimes was purging, throwing up, sometimes wasn't, but really making herself quite sick, right? So we worked just once a week for 3 months, and she was completely resolved, did not have any binge eating issues again after that. Um, and what we ended up focusing on was like that process that I was talking about, and a lot of internal shame that she had around her body size. She was one that she was always bigger ever since she was a little child, and so got bullied in elementary school, and that shame just compounded and compounded. And it's counterintuitive, you think if you have like shame about being big, that would motivate you to diet and exercise and to have healthy habits. So that's not the way that our brains work. Our brains are set up to, if we've experienced distress, we want dopamine. So we go to the thing that gives us dopamine. And it's the exact same thing that happens in addiction to substances. And what happens over time is that the brain becomes rewired after binging consistently to where it's experiencing dopamine so much from that it has a hard time experiencing dopamine from other things that it should be experiencing dopamine from. So in a way, the survival center of the brain gets hijacked to thinking, okay, if I'm in distress, then I'm in danger, and the way to safety is food. And so that causes this cycle where shame is distress, feels bad, then we go to food, and that rewiring that in the body and rewiring that, releasing that sense of shame, and going in and incorporating those younger parts of self. Most kids don't tell anyone when they're being bullied, right? So there were these young pieces of her that were unseen, unheard, very invisible, while at the same time being bullied for being too big, too seen, right? So really complicated situation this little girl inside of her was in. So when we were able to bring that little girl in and allow her to feel the comfort of the present and talk about her story, then she was able to resolve her eating.
Okay. Wow, that is amazing. Just really uncovering maybe thoughts or feelings that have been repressed over the years to
Yeah.
really get those out and move forward with healthier habits.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, because I mean, most people know what it means to be healthy, right? They know that binging every night isn't going to lead to a healthy body, right? So it's not
Sure.
the knowledge is there. It's just this deeper down system. And even analyzing that and sitting back and talking about it, saying like, oh yeah, it makes sense where this is stemming from. That doesn't do much for it other than more knowledge. So we end up reading articles and absorbing knowledge in as many ways as possible, hoping that that's going to help. But that knowledge is stored in the upper regions of the brain, and it's not connected to that little girl. The upper regions of our brain don't even come online until we're 1.5 years old. They don't even exist. And then they're not
Okay.
fully developed until we're 25. So we can't use, and research has shown that we can't use those upper regions of our brain to convince the lower regions of our brain of anything. It's like trying to convince a 6-month-old to not cry all night tonight. Right? It's
Sure.
a fun idea, but the 6-month-old, they're going to cry anyway, right? So we have to engage the lower regions of the brain and the body in order to really resolve that stuff that happened before we had the capacity to absorb and maintain information. It's totally different systems in the brain.
Okay. Interesting. Wow. Now, what is for those, just kind of maybe realizing this types of situation, what is generally the first step to healing and health and restoring their health?
Yeah. I mean, that is the first step, just realizing and saying like, "Oh my gosh, okay, maybe this is a route that I can take." And there is, there's plenty of help out there. Again, like if you're looking for a complex trauma specialist, trauma is a big keyword these days that a lot of people are using. Oh, I work with trauma, I work with trauma. So you really want to have a conversation. You want to shop around and have a conversation with them. What really is their understanding of trauma? What do their sessions look like? To really get a good feel, like, do they understand trauma? But if you're not at a place where you can reach out, whether financially or for whatever reason you can't get help from a professional, one really simple thing that you can start to do, that just helps balance out the nervous system. So if you're in that stress response, and that stress response is causing poor eating choices, just taking a step back and doing a simple breathing technique that activates the relaxed state in your body. And that is just simply breathing out for longer than you breathe in. You don't have to
Okay.
change anything about what you're breathing, but we do it naturally when we're asleep. We go, right? And it's that
Sure.
same breath where you just breathe in and then you just make sure that you breathe out longer than you were breathing in. And that switches us out of that hot, stressed system in our body. And then shifting from aggressive exercises to exercises where you're really listening to your body. And there's a lot of resistance when it comes to that. It's like, no, I need to burn calories. But burning calories isn't going to really matter if your system is just pumping sugar and fat into itself.
Mhm.
You need to stop that from happening first. So slowing down and doing those low, slow exercises, breathing, yoga, even just stretching on a daily basis and noticing the muscles that are activated, paying attention to your body, what does it want to do? Those things are really beneficial. And then of course, mindful eating, thinking about the bites that you're taking, thinking about the nutrition in the bites, and thinking about it as, what does my body need? What does my body need more of? As opposed to, what do I need to cut out of my body? So that can also trigger that response of lack and of scarcity, right? And put us into a stress state of like, oh my gosh, there's not enough, or I can't have this thing. I'm not good enough to have these things. Oh, other people can have these things, but I can't have this thing, right? And that's stressful. So we
Sure.
want to think more along the lines of, what does my body need today? What is the nutrition that I need today? What does my body need more of today? And what does this taste like in my mouth? What is it? Just really acknowledging and being very focused on getting our needs met through eating.
Okay. That's interesting. I love that the combined therapy, so to speak, or a combined different avenues of approach. Fantastic. Well, Andrea, how can people get in contact with you?
Yeah, so my website is Andrea Hanson, and that's with an O-N, HANSON, .net. And it's just a pretty simple site. You can email me through there, or if you're on Facebook or Instagram, or I think even LinkedIn, my little tag is at Andrea Hanson Psych. So again, Hanson with an O-N, ANDREA HANSON Psych. That's my handle on all of the different social medias.
Mm. Okay, fantastic. Well, we will include all of those in the show notes. And it has been a pleasure having you on the show today and just really diving into trauma and what it means and what it means to be healthy and that there is a way out of that situation. That's fantastic. But thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate you having me. It's been great talking to you.